partnership with the Prospect Heights Natural Resource Commission. And tonight we've invited professional urban beekeeper Grace Hart. Welcome, Grace.
Hi, okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Today we're going to be talking about the Save the Bees movement, kind of where it came from, what it means, and we're going to talk about our friends the honeybees, and it is working again. Thank you. We're going to talk about our friends the honeybees, and do they play a role? What is their job in this whole kind of narrative of saving the bees? So before I jump into this, I'm going to give a quick introduction into who I am. I have some fun pictures for you here. As Terry said, I'm a professional urban beekeeper. This is my 9-to-5 full-time job. I work in the Chicago area, primarily in downtown, but then I also travel out to the suburbs and I do what we call turnkey beekeeping service. So people will hire my company to set up a hive, take care of it, do all of the maintenance and the harvest and the extraction. So basically, we do all of the messy, sticky stuff, and they get to have a honeybee hive on their property. And they also get me or another beekeeper to come and do some educational workshops for them. So these pictures are from some beautiful hives that we have. On the far left is a hive in downtown Chicago, right in kind of the Fulton Market area. And all the way on the right is all the way down south in Evergreen Park. So we've got hives kind of everywhere, and it's a really special job, and I love doing it. And I did include this wonderful picture in the middle to show you one of my favorite parts about the job, aside from the bees, is that I get some of the best views of Chicago that nobody else gets to see. Because oftentimes during the day, I am on top of a rooftop by myself. I maybe spend more time talking to bees than I talk to people, and that's okay. I kind of like it that way, so just thought I would share this. It's kind of a really fun thing. Most of the historic buildings downtown that you hear about if you ever go on the Riverwalk architecture tour, my company Alvéole has bees on top of them. So if you are ever hanging out in downtown Chicago, give a little wink to the bees, know that they're there, and smile at them a little bit. I also maintain a beehive on the Prospect Heights Prairie nearby. That beehive is sponsored by ComEd, and so on site you have one honeybee hive and 2 wild bee homes. The wild bee homes are new this year, and it's really exciting. I did include some pictures of the very first residents that are starting to make their homes inside the wild bee homes. If you can see up here in this corner, those are 2 leafcutter bees that have made their nests inside of the home. They do something really cool. They can actually cut perfect circles out of leaves, and then they make kind of a bee-rito. There's a bee pun for you. They make a bee-rito with an egg filled with something called pollen butter. That is pollen and nectar mixed together that's meant to be food for that egg once it emerges into a larva. So up there you have your leafcutter bees. Is really exciting. I just saw this for the first time last week, and I was so excited about it. And something very interesting is happening in these observation drawers here. You are not mistaken if you thought those were crickets. That is what they are. And those were put there by something called a grass-carrying wasp. That is a native wasp species that actually lines their nest with tree crickets. Similar to the pollen butter from the leafcutter bee, they line their nest with tree crickets and grass to provide food. So I opened that and it was a little spooky at first, and then I figured out what it was, and I'm very excited. So that was just kind of a quick aside so we could talk about how cool the wild bee homes are that are out on the prairie. And the honeybee hive is doing really, really well. We are actually going to be harvesting honey from them in a couple of weeks. And that's going to be really exciting. They've made a lot of honey in there. So pivoting back to the reason why we're here, we're going to talk about the origin of the Save the Bees movement. You've probably heard somebody say Save the Bees before. That's a pretty safe bet. A lot of people talk about it. And it originated sometime around the 90s when something called colony collapse disorder became very prevalent in beekeepers' hives. And so, as the name really succinctly explains, it's basically when an entire colony of honeybees just collapses and they die. So beekeepers were coming to their hives that had previously had a bustling colony inside, and they would find either all of the bees inside that had died, or it would just be completely empty. So as you can imagine, that is a pretty alarming thing to see. I really care about my bees, and a lot of beekeepers do really take pride in their hives. And so coming to a hive that was doing really well, to find them all passed away is really alarming. So we have come to figure out that colony collapse disorder is caused by kind of three main factors. There are, of course, other things involved, but today we're going to be talking about varroa mites, the use of neonicotinoids, and monocultures, and a general lack of nutritional resources for the bees. So we'll get into details on those right now. This is a photo of the varroa mite, kind of the enemy to the beekeeper. They give me the creeps, if we're being honest. Their scientific name is Varroa destructor, if that tells you anything about the negative effect they can have on a honeybee colony. So this is a very zoomed in picture. They are actually quite small, and they are a parasite that comes inside of beehives and feeds on the fat bodies of the honeybees. So it does a number of things to them. Primarily, the most noticeable thing at first is that oftentimes when a beehive has a high mite count, they are very, very grumpy. And so kind of my first sign if I go into a hive and they're just really upset with me for seemingly no reason, I go, I'm going to do a mite test on them. Because they say that picture yourself as a big human-sized honeybee. They say that a varroa mite would be equivalent to the size of a large cheeseburger on your back, punctured into your skin, feeding off of your fat bodies and weakening your immune system. Yes, exactly. That's how I feel about it too. They're pretty creepy. So it makes the bees pretty upset, but beyond that, it weakens their immune system and can cause a lot of havoc in a hive and makes them more susceptible to diseases. So primarily the first thing that I notice is something called deformed wing virus, which is where the honeybees will have kind of shriveled up wings. It's also called stick wing virus sometimes. And their wings will just be really tiny, shriveled up, and not functional. So they also can't fly out to forage. So if you start to see deformed wing virus inside of a hive, that's also a sign that there are quite a bit of varroa mites in there. Secondly, we have neonicotinoids. They are a class of pesticide, and they're one of the most widely used in the world. They are applied to a lot of plants in many different ways, primarily through applying to the seeds and to the foliage of the plant. They stick around for quite a long time. They can last in the soil for several years. There were some studies done on woody plants that had had neonicotinoids applied to them, and the presence of those pesticides were there for upwards of 6 years. So these stick around for quite a long time, and they also can stick around in the soil as well. So when these neonicotinoids are applied to plants, they can get absorbed, and then they are present in the pollen and nectar. So as you can imagine, when you have bees and butterflies and everybody coming to visit your plants that have been treated with neonicotinoids, they are consuming them, they are bringing them back to their hives, and it's not a really good thing for them. It can also contaminate nearby vegetation. So if you treat, say you put Roundup on your garden plants, that is one neonicotinoid that you can buy in the store. Say you put that on your plants in your garden, and next door you have a nice pollinator bee and butterfly garden. Those plants, they talk to each other and they can get the neonicotinoids on those pollinator plants. So as you can imagine, these are not great. When bees are exposed to neonicotinoids at high enough levels, it can be lethal. But even at sublethal levels, it can take the development time of the bees. It makes it longer. It also means that some of the brood won't develop into maturity. And it also just kind of reduces their bodily functions so that they are not very efficient at pollinating. So they might get disoriented. They may not be able to smell very well. They might get lost. So very bad. Yes, do we agree? Lastly, we're going to talk about monocultures and kind of a general lack of nutritional diversity for the honeybees. if you don't know, our global food system really relies on monoculture croppings. And what that means is it's going to be a really large planting of just one plant. And so a lot of our land in the US is taken up by industrial farmland that is just one plant. So generally, as a society, we don't really value planting native plants. We have a lot of big grass lawns that we spend a lot of time and effort into maintaining instead of planting native plants. So it's really just kind of a problem that there aren't a lot of resources for bees to pollinate from. The other thing about monocultures is that they are very susceptible to disease, weather, and pests. So the solution to that is more pesticides, more neonicotinoids. It's like, say, you had one really big planting of tomatoes. If anyone has ever had tomatoes in their garden and found tomato hornworms, you know how they can just completely devastate your tomato plant, right? So picture you had a huge field with all tomatoes and you knew that there were tomato hornworms in there. What are you gonna do? You're gonna apply pesticides because you wanna save your crop, right? So not only are the monocultures and the kind of lack of nutritional resources, contributing to poor immune health by not having proper food for them, it is also exposing them to more pesticides. So a lot of people think when they talk about saving the bees, they think we're just gonna take more honeybees, take the number that's there and double it, triple it, quadruple it, have as many as we can, and that's gonna save the bees. And that's unfortunately not true. More hives does not mean that every beekeeper is going to be treating for mites. It does not mean that we are going to stop using neonicotinoids, and it does not mean that there are magically going to be more plantings of native plants. So we are in need of a much more comprehensive solution, and so it's really not as black and white as just, we're going to put a honeybee hive up and call it a day and we're saving the bees. They are wonderful, but they're not quite that catch-all solution that we need. And the other thing you want to think about too is that you don't want to overpopulate an area with too many honeybees, because when you get to that place, then eventually they may start outcompeting for resources from the native pollinators during certain times of the season. So I love honeybees. Obviously, I work with them every single day, but they are not necessarily the direct solution to what the problems we're talking about. The other thing to consider when we talk about saving the bees and colony collapse disorder is that they actually apply to all of our other pollinators as well. Honeybees were just the most visible thing. There are beekeepers looking inside of their hive, examining the frames, maybe weekly, maybe monthly, throughout the season. So it's very easy for that problem to be noticed pretty early on within a honeybee hive because it's an obvious drastic change. Whereas we have upwards of 4,000 native bee species in North America and around 500 just in Illinois. So a lot of those species are solitary and they nest in tubes like those leafcutter bees that we saw the picture of their nest. And so it's not really visible. You can't really directly see, hey, these bees are also having a problem. So that's kind of why the Save the Bees movement is mainly focused on honeybees, because it came from honeybees, but I'm kind of here to dispel that and talk about how it's a bigger problem. Now, varroa mites are mostly unique to the European honeybee that we keep. They don't really prey on wild bees in the same way, but I will say that when they are inside of a honeybee hive and they cause those diseases, they make the immune system weaker, those honeybees can come into contact with other pollinators while they're out at flowers, and they can spread disease in that way. So while the varroa are not a direct issue for the native pollinators, they are still a problem. But the neonicotinoids and the poor nutrition does affect our other native bees in the world. So Save the Bees has been pretty misconstrued. It is important to keep in mind that while honeybees are great, they are a non-native species and they are considered an agricultural animal. They are very important to our food system and to our society because they are very important for pollinating a lot of our crops, but it's bigger than that. 52% of native bee species are in decline. So that's a really, really staggering number. if you think about that within the scale of how many species we were talking about, out of 4,000 species in North America, that's 2,000 that need help. So that's a lot. They really also need us. So you might be thinking at this point, okay, honeybees are cool, but they're not helping save the bees, so why are we keeping them? There are a lot of reasons why people might keep a honeybee hive. They're all totally valid, totally great. I'm going to go over a couple that are kind of independent of the Save the Bees movement before we jump into how they fit into the Save the Bees narrative. So, number one, honey and hive products. They are wonderful. Everybody here, I bet, has eaten honey. You've probably used beeswax in candles. You've probably used beeswax shoe polish. And if you haven't heard of propolis, it is a resin that bees collect from trees, and people actually use that. They'll make tinctures out of it. They'll make incense. It smells really nice. And so there are a lot of really nice products from the hive that we can gain. And they're really wonderful. There's nothing wrong with this being your motivation behind keeping bees. Honey obviously tastes good. It's very nutritionally dense. And the colony does make a surplus of honey. So you can, if you're being responsible about it, you can harvest a good amount of honey from your hive while still keeping them safe and letting them have enough food to go into the winter. There are a lot of health benefits that people claim with eating honey. I've had people, while I work this job as beekeeping, I've had people tell me everything under the sun that they do with honey. They've said they make taffy out of it. People have said they put it on their cuts because it's antibacterial. You can really get creative with honey. So, and the other thing about it is that culturally, food really brings us together, and honey is a big part of that conversation. So I personally really love to talk to my neighbors, bring them a jar of honey and trade with them. Hey, I'll give you a jar of my honey for that jam you made with your peaches. You know, it's really wonderful, and it's a great kind of cultural icon for us. The relationship between humans and honeybees has been lasting for a very long time. And if you look back all the way to ancient Egypt, society valued honey in a similar way that we do, if not even more. They kind of almost used it as a currency. Pharaohs were buried with honey in their tomb because it was so valuable to them. So honey is great, hive products are wonderful as well. The other thing, this is kind of also personally speaks to the reasons why I enjoy beekeeping. I am going to talk about this picture here. This is my wonderful coworker, Dana. She's having a little calm meditative moment in an area full of bees. I don't know if you can quite understand the gravity of just how many bees were flying around in this picture. They're clinging to the tree behind her. Over here, they're all over in the air. There's this bee that got in front of the camera there. They are really calming little critters to spend time with. If you noticed in those pictures of me beekeeping from the beginning of the presentation, I was not wearing any protective gear, and no, I did not get any stings. Not everybody chooses to go that route with their beekeeping. It's totally okay to wear protective gear. But for me, beekeeping is almost kind of like a calming, meditative experience because the bees really respond to the way you move with them and the way you act with them. They communicate in pheromones, so they can sense my pheromones as well. I always say to never beekeep while you're angry because the bees know. They know, and that's not scientifically proven, but you believe me, right? I'm a professional beekeeper. So, if you move really slowly and smoothly while you're inside of a hive, chances are you can get in and out without getting any stings. And the reason why I choose not to wear a veil most of the time when I beekeep is because my job is to teach people about bees, teach people about nature and ecology, and to teach them that they don't need to be afraid of our pollinators. So that's why I personally choose it. But I really don't get stung that often. Sometimes I wear protective gear, but it's really kind of a special thing to be connected with your bees. I don't wear gloves or anything. This at the bottom where I said live longer is kind of a funny joke in the beekeeping community because there's this old wives' tale that beekeepers live longer. I'm not sure exactly why, but it is kind of funny to think about and kind of just amuses me a little bit that maybe I'll live longer because I'm a beekeeper. So now, what about saving the bees? Why are we keeping them for this purpose? You know, it's kind of a disconnected thing here. We're not directly going to save any bees by putting more honeybees out there, right? Well, a honeybee hive actually works really, really well as a bioindicator. So they are very efficient at pollinating. They can pollinate in up to a 3-mile radius around the hive. So they are collecting, basically they're handing us samples of all of the plants that are existing around their hive. So specifically, Alvéole, the company that I work for, has started partnering with this company called Apilab. They are, I believe, a Swiss company. And we're doing this really cool thing with some of our clients this year where we're taking samples from the hive of pollen and honey, sending them off to a lab, getting them analyzed, and then we can come back with a report that says, here are all of the plants that they were foraging from, here is how everything is going. We can say, what are you missing? What do you need to plant to help out these bees? So if you're thinking back to when we were talking about a lack of nutrition for bees, how do you figure out what you need? The bees can tell you. They can tell you, what are you missing? And that can help expose seasonal weaknesses, which are, you know, in the spring and the early spring and the late fall are when we start to think about problems of competition between different bee species. So you can look at specifically those times of the year and pinpoint what you need to plant to help improve the landscape to help not only the honeybees, but also all of the native pollinators. And this, you know, this is less scientific based, but honeybees are iconic. They are kind of a cultural phenomenon. Everybody knows about them. Everybody you talk to has some kind of impression of honeybees. They can tell you, oh, I have a friend that keeps a beehive in their yard, or I bought honey from my beekeeper at my farmer's market. Everyone knows about them, and so they're a very excellent ambassador for pollinators. As I touched on earlier, a lot of our pollinators are solitary, so you know we can have them live in our wild bee homes on the prairie like the leafcutter bees, but we can't really look up close and personal at them the way you can a honeybee hive. So in this picture you can see a frame of bees. Most beekeepers use what's called a Langstroth beehive, which is a hive box that has 10 frames in it that look like this. And it's very cool. I can go through the hive and look at each frame and examine the health of the hive. I can look at how much honey they have. I can see the health of the brood, which this is a beautiful, beautiful frame of brood. I know this queen bee was doing really well. So I am really able to examine them and look at them up close. And so this really encourages a connection with nature in people who maybe they're a little shy, they're kind of scared, they want to stay away. I can show them these bees and show them that it's really exciting and really something we need to be thinking about. And at the bottom here, I've written something called Frame Moment. That is something that we consider to be very, very special and one of our really big goals with Alvéole, the company I work for. And that is this. These are 3 different people from all over Illinois. This picture comes from Schaumburg, this is in Naperville, and this is in downtown Chicago. Now, these people in these photos have never ever touched a beehive before in their entire lives when I took these pictures. And they all came in, the thing that they have in common, even though they came from different areas, is that they were all afraid of bees when I first started talking to them. So I'm going to talk about Miata over here. She works at the University of Chicago. And the way she has really changed her tune on the bees, when I first started keeping bees on her rooftop, she was so scared. She would stand super far away. She would be really nervous and wouldn't come anywhere near me. And she told me she was terrified of bees. And now, every time I come to visit her hive, she runs out of her office and volunteers to be the person to take me up on the roof and loves these bees more than anybody else I have ever talked to. And she has told me stories too about when she's sitting on the ground level on a bench and she sees some bees, she thinks about her hive and just is so proud of them. So this is something that's really, really special. And you can't really get that with a lot of other animals. These bees are very docile. As you can see, also none of these people are wearing protective gear, no stings, everybody is A-okay. And it's just kind of the most wonderful part about how honeybees can help. I've got a couple other cool pictures for you here to share. On the left here, we've got a building engineer. He comes out with me every single time I inspect the hive, and he loves those bees too. This is a manager at an office building, and these are his 2 daughters. And they came out to the hive also very afraid. And this was our harvest visit, and you can see there I am showing them the beehive, talking to them about the honeybees, and getting them very excited at a super young age. And then even younger, we have an early childhood development class over here that came out to their hive install in Skokie, and I actually installed those hives into a community apiary. And so there are other beekeepers that are starting to take beekeeping classes and put up hives inside of that apiary. And then over here, this is at an office building in downtown Chicago on a very, very tall building, and we're having another honeybee moment with a frame. So honeybees, the answer to the question, why honeybees and what role do they play in saving the bees, is that they are an excellent, excellent first step into making change happen. People, when they fall in love with their honeybee hive and they get to have that frame moment, they ask, well, what can I do? How do I help them? Because there's a lot of sad things and scary things facing our pollinators. And so it's incredible to start conversations. We kind of hook them in with the honeybee because they're cute and they're fuzzy and everyone likes honey, and then they're kind of trapped. It's like a gotcha. You know, you love your honeybees, what about all of these bees? So I have a background in environmental education, ecology, and everything like that. And something that I have found in talking about people and climate change and things that are negatively affecting our ecosystems is that change will not happen if people don't care. We have to have movements of people that are trying to make stuff happen. So that kind of answers your question of why do we keep honeybees, right? So maybe I was droning on for a little bit too long. There were a lot of pictures. Maybe you were thinking about what you were going to eat for dinner. This is our takeaway page. If you weren't listening to anything in the talk, this is what I want you to think about moving forward. Number 1, when people say save the bees, it is not just about honeybees. All of our pollinators are threatened and all of them need help. Think about that 52% number. That is very, very high, and they all need our help. Number 2, honeybees are an excellent first step, but please don't stop after just putting a honeybee hive out there. It's really great and exciting, and it's wonderful to engage people with a honeybee hive, but there's so much more that needs to be done beyond the honeybee hive. Number 3, and these are in no particular order of importance, by the way, they're all pretty important at this point. Number 3 is that we really should probably cool it with the neonicotinoids. They are obviously very detrimental to our pollinators, and we can buy them at the store, and they're also used on widespread commercial applications. And some provinces in Canada have banned their use. It's possible for that to happen. So if we make enough noise about it, and if people stop personally buying them for their gardens, that could make a big change. Number 4, we want to support our local food systems, because local farmers and food growers are really the type of people that are doing their best to protect the native ecosystem. So those people are the people you want to know, and those are the people you want to support with your dollars, support with your volunteer time, support with your energy, to be able to encourage and uplift what they are doing to help pollinators. And lastly, and certainly not least, if you have a window box, if you have a yard space, please plant as many native flowers as you can. They are the most nutritionally beneficial for bees. I'm really excited to hear people talking about things like no-mow May and everything. Like the honeybees, that is a really great first step, but it's not quite enough. I will tell you, dandelions are wonderful. People think about them in their yard. But nutritionally, a dandelion is not going to be as good for this purple coneflower that's here on the right, or the bee balm that's in the middle. Just like people, bees also do well to have a varied diet. So They really like to have high protein, they need carbs, they need all of these things. And so if you have a garden space, please plant native pollinator plants. They are quite beautiful and they are typically drought resistant in our region because Illinois is very dry sometimes. And they're beautiful. So that is all I have for you right now. I'm going to open it up for questions. If anybody wants to talk about bees, talk about our talk about saving bees, now is the time to do so. Where does pollen come from that you buy? So
That we're supposed to eat.
yes, so people eat pollen a lot of times because it's kind of like an exposure to allergens to kind of help you develop a tolerance to seasonal allergens. Pollen that you buy does come from honeybees. There is a little kind of a tool that you can put on the entrance of your hive that's a pollen collector. And so basically the bee has to walk through it to get inside of the hive, and that pollen is held onto their legs. If you've ever seen pollen pants on a bee, pollen is held onto their legs with a hair structure and some kind of like static energy, static electricity. And so going through that pollen trap will kind of knock the pollen off of their legs, and then it can be harvested. Now, you need to be responsible about how long and how often you're putting that on your hive, because the pollen is food for developing bees. So if you leave it on there all season, they're not going to be able to feed their baby bees, and the hive will not do well.
So downtown Chicago, you've got the hives up there. There aren't that many flowers down there. Where do they get it?
Yeah, so the question is, in downtown Chicago, there aren't that many flowers. How do the bees do well? They actually can thrive in an urban environment. They can fly upwards of 3 miles out and back. So they can even kind of leave the city limits if they needed to. But in Chicago, we have a lot of really beautiful native plantings where they actually can find a lot of resources within the city, which is kind of one of the things that we like to challenge, that idea that, oh, it's a city, it's just concrete, there's nothing there. There's a lot of plant life, there's a lot of pollinators, there's a lot of bees, there's a lot of parks. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a Prospect Heights half acre.
Okay.
It's full of clover and violets.
Nice.
Am I doing my part?
So the question is, in Prospect Heights with a half acre full of clover and violets, are you doing your part? I would say that's really wonderful. It's, I would never say to anybody that what you're doing is not enough. Anything is helpful, especially if that was a plot of land that was maybe originally grass. Clover is way better than grass, violets is way better than grass. So yeah, that's really great and wonderful that you have that in your land. That's going to be an excellent resource for the bees. A lot of people say that white clover is a really good thing to replace a grass lawn with, specifically for pollinators, but also it's very drought resistant and everything like that.
Is powdered sugar, do you put powdered sugar on bees to prevent the mites?
So the question is, do you put powdered sugar on bees to prevent the mites? Not quite. It is kind of a related thing. Powdered sugar can be used in a form of mite testing within the hive. Basically, what you do is you have a little cup and you take a frame of bees. You make sure the queen's not on there. And you take a brush and you brush a sample size of bees inside of your cup and you cover them in powdered sugar. It's called a sugar roll. You kind of swirl the bees around in the powdered sugar and then give them some time. And basically the concept is that because the bees are covered in sugar, they're going to clean themselves. And if they have mites on their back, they knock the mites off. So then you can take a number, there are this many bees or this many mites from my sugar roll out of my sample size of 300 bees. What I will say is that it is not the most effective way to test for mites because it's not very guaranteed that the bees are going to detach those mites from their back. But if you have heard about powdered sugar and mites, that's kind of their application in that realm, is to do a sugar roll to test for the presence of mites.
How can you get rid of the mites then? How can the bees get rid of them?
So how can you get rid of mites? The mites are a pretty bad problem within honeybee hives. So at this point, it does require beekeeper intervention. They aren't going to clean it off by themselves. So basically you give them, there's many different types of treatments you can give them. There's one called amitraz. That's kind of synthetic and a little bit of a kind of a nasty chemical, so a lot of beekeepers don't like to use that, but amitraz is something that you can put in the hive in a little plastic strip, and it paralyzes the mites so that, and then they fall off and they can't eat. But what I like to use is something called formic acid. It is a lab-made version of an acid that ants naturally make, and it's just kind of stinky. It smells like sour candy, and so you apply it into the hive in a little patty, and it vaporizes into the hive and basically kills the mites, and they fall off of the bees. So there are a lot of treatments you can do. There is one more treatment. These are like kind of the three main. The third main treatment is something called oxalic acid, which I think is also used as wood bleach in other realms not related to beekeeping. But you mix oxalic acid with sugar syrup and you dribble it over the bees. And for that one, actually, scientists are not really sure how that one works, but it does really work to help eliminate the mites. But that one is only safe for when there is no capped brood in the hive because it can't penetrate the wax, if that makes sense.
What can you do preventatively?
Preventatively, I would say the best thing to do to prevent mites is to just be testing regularly for mites. And then as soon as you notice, you got to treat them. Because at this point, the way it is that most honeybee hives will have varroa mites. It's more so how do you mitigate that risk? How do you manage them and keep the population low? So there is drift that happens between honeybee hives where maybe a forager goes out and visits a plant, visits a flower, and then they get tired and they don't want to go all the way back to their own house. They might go back to another hive. And so this drift that happens, even if your hive is completely mite-free, they're still going to have interactions with other bees from other hives that can bring mites into their environment.
Is there a high season for the mites? Is there a certain period?
Is there a high season for the mites? Not necessarily. It is something, mite presence will very exponentially grow throughout the season, so you do want to treat early and soon. And also, if your hive is an overwintered hive instead of a new package, you want to treat sooner as well, because it was originally thought that when the queen takes a break from laying eggs in the winter, it was enough to kind of kill out the mites and starve them off because they like to hide in the brood of the hive. But we've realized that it's not quite long enough. So when you have a hive coming out of surviving over the winter, that might count as going to be a lot higher at the beginning of the season than a fresh package or like a nuke that you bought from a clean hive.
Do honeybees make nests in trees, or do they always like these boxes with slats?
So do honeybees make nests in trees? Honeybees can build honeycomb out of beeswax, but they can't build a structure to protect that. So the reason why they exist when a beekeeper is taking care of them inside of the beehive is because they need something there to protect them from elements, predators, things like that. Bears really like to eat developing brood inside of a hive for protein, which thankfully isn't a problem here, but it is a problem in other places. So to answer your question, they like to naturally, when they are not taken care of by a beekeeper, they like to go inside of a structure that already exists. So that might be a hollowed out tree. That might be somebody's floorboards in their shed. So yes, they do like to be inside of something sturdy.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of the individual bees in the hive? Like some of them are workers and some of them are guardians, apparently. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the question for the Zoom people, can I talk about the roles of the different bees inside of the hive? Inside of a hive population, we have about 90% female worker bees and about 10% male drone bees. And the male drone bees are kind of interesting. They are born via a haploid unfertilized egg. And they don't do anything except for leave the hive to go and mate with other queen bees. I see you celebrating over there, but they do die when they mate with queen bees. So it's not really quite the best situation for them. It is kind of a tough life at the end. And if at the end of the season they haven't mated with a queen, their sisters actually evict them from the hive to die. So they say, you get out, you're not going to do anything helpful, so you can go and die in the cold. It's a little bit brutal. So those are your drone bees. And then worker bees, we're not really sure like what the division of percentage of worker bees are, but they do every job in the hive throughout their life until they die. They start out as cleaning the hive, so they emerge from their cell and they turn around and clean the cell that they came out of. They clean sticks and leaves out of there. They build wax. They build the wax into honeycomb. Sometimes certain worker bees will become part of the queen's entourage. They will feed the developing brood. They will, like I said, clean up the hive. They all participate in thermoregulation of the hive. So they will fan air through the hive with their wings to keep it cool in the summer. And in the winter, they vibrate their wing muscles to make heat when it's cold. They will also forage, and they will also be guard bees, where they're in charge of protecting the hive. So usually the first job is cleaner, the last job is forager bee. And oftentimes they work so darn hard that they actually die when they're out on their last foraging flight. So kind of poetic, kind of heartbreaking, but also really sweet that they want so much to help their family.
Can you talk about swarming?
Yeah, so swarming is a natural impulse that happens. It's not a bad thing necessarily. It's something that beekeepers try to prevent because we like our bees and we want to keep them inside of our hive. But when a honeybee colony gets really, really big and they decide they've outgrown their home, something that starts the swarm impulse is that the queen's pheromones get diluted when there are a lot of bees in the hive. And so they start to get the itch to swarm. And so they build special cells that look kind of like a peanut, and they make a new queen in there. It's a regular worker bee egg, and they feed her royal jelly, which turns her into a queen bee while she develops. And so they'll make maybe 4 or 5 new queens, and then before those queens emerge, the current queen of the hive and a big chunk of the population will leave and try to find a new home. And then they left behind those queen cells for one of them to emerge, and then she will go and sting the other ones or fight the other ones to the death, and then she will go out on her mating flight to become the new queen of the colony.
So you don't lose the colony when they swarm?
Not necessarily. It does set your colony back a fair amount, so you might not have as productive of a season honey production wise. Also, if it happens late in the season, their likelihood of requeening and having the queen go on her mating flight and come back gets a lot lower. So you don't want it to happen because it's not great. It's possible they won't requeen themselves, and then you have to give them a new queen or give them eggs from another hive or something like that in order to help them correct it. We had a question back there too. Yeah, you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just have a question. Have you noticed the difference between oxalic acid treatment? Also, have you vaporized oxalic acid?
So the question is, do I notice a difference between oxalic acid and formic, and have I vaporized oxalic acid? It's kind of getting into technical beekeeping terms. I like them both. I don't necessarily like one more than the other. I think they both have their proper application during the time of the season. I like oxalic acid because you can get in one last mite treatment before wintering when there's no more capped brood in the hive. I like formic which oxalic acid is also now considered legally to be safe to use with honey supers on the hive if you need to. But formic acid is really safe. It's totally safe to use with a honey super on the hive, and it does not affect your food quality at all. And formic acid can penetrate the wax capping. So my recommendation would be, yes, use both. I have not personally vaporized oxalic acid. I have heard from other beekeepers that Some people really love it and some people don't love it. I know for me, it is pretty intense exposure to that chemical and you need like a big respirator mask in order to do that. Whereas the dribble, you wear gloves and goggles, but other than that, it's pretty safe.
I just found it's like, it's been more effective with my heart.
Oh, good to know.
It's an easier application, especially during the time.
Grace, we have a couple questions on Zoom.
Okay, great.
What are the best native plants to put in our yards for the bees?
So there are a lot of really wonderful ones. To name a few off the top of my head, I really like purple coneflower. I like black-eyed Susan. I like bee balm. It's pretty purple. There's also scarlet bee balm that's red. I really like goldenrod because it's one of the plants that blooms late in the season, right after kind of what's called a nectar dearth, where there's not a lot of things in bloom for the bees. I will say for any beekeepers out there, goldenrod nectar is stinky and it smells like socks. But, so a lot of beekeepers don't like goldenrod, but I kind of like it because it's like that sign of hope after the nectar dearth is ending, that the goldenrod nectar, your hives stink like socks, the goldenrod is blooming, and they've made it to another period where there's food for them. So those are just a few that I like. My recommendation would be, if you're looking to plant a pollinator garden, I would choose several plants that bloom at different times of the season. Because a lot of things bloom at similar times, whereas you could have purple coneflower for the middle of the season, goldenrod for the end of the season, and all of the ones that are early season are escaping my mind, but they do exist. So if you look it up, that's what I would recommend.
Okay, another question is, what do the bees do in the wintertime?
In the wintertime, the bees stay inside of the hive. They stop flying at around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. It gets too cold once it gets colder than that for their bodies to move. So if it's much colder than that, they might leave the hive and get stuck because they can't move because it's too cold. So they stay in the hive. They do something called clustering, which is where they will ball around the queen and they're trying to create heat. And so they're shaking their little bodies around, creating heat. They mostly don't leave the hive in the winter, except approximately once a month on the warmest day they will leave to go relieve themselves because they don't like to poop in the hive. They're very neat critters. If you ever interact with a beehive when it's really cold out in the early spring, they will poop on you. So they go on the nice word we like to use is the cleansing flight. So they go on their cleansing flight a couple times throughout the winter, and it's yellow. It's pretty cute, the little bee poop. But yeah, so we basically, as the beekeeper, it's my job to make sure that I'm setting the bees up as much as I can to succeed over the winter. So I make sure they have enough space, but not too much. I make sure they have a low mite count. I make sure they still have a queen, that they have enough food. A lot of different factors, and then some beekeepers don't wrap their hives and some beekeepers do. Alvéole, we do wrap them, and so we put basically a puffy jacket around the hive made out of kind of the same material as those heavy-duty black trash bags. Sometimes they don't make it through the winter, unfortunately. It is a reality of beekeeping, but if you set them up as best as you can send them luck over the winter and wish them luck, and hopefully they make it through.
I've seen a variety of coneflowers this year and have planted yellow.
Oh, very cool.
Is that a good one too?
So are yellow coneflowers good? I have not personally heard of them, but I'm sure they're wonderful. It's probably similar to the regular bee balm and the scarlet bee balm. They nutritionally are probably pretty similar for the bees, just might be a different color.
Grace, what's your take on the Comet Prairie there? Is that a suitable habitat for them?
What's my take on the Comet Prairie? Is it a suitable habitat for the bees? It's wonderful. They're having a great season. They're doing so well. The bees have a ton of honey. Yes, it's great. It's a really awesome prairie planting, and it makes me happy to see it all the time. Give a quick plug to Dana and his team. Over here.
The guard bees are supposed to be able to determine the difference between their queen's pheromone and another. How do the mites get in? Or do they just like attract the pheromone from the bee they're attacking?
So how do the mites get into the hive, and are they attracted to the pheromone? Is that what you're saying?
Is that how they get in there?
So, you know, that's kind of a question I've never really thought about the answer to before. If I had to give my best educated guess about it, I do know that the varroa mite originally came from a different type of honeybee, an Asian species of honeybee, and then eventually spread to European colonies of honeybees. So I imagine the way that happened was from the drift between hives. And that's kind of your number one source, basically. And when you make a new hive, one of the ways that you can do that is by splitting another hive that's really big. So you take away frames of brood with eggs and honey and things like that, and you can either give them a new queen, or you can let them try to make a new one based on the eggs that are in there. And so if parent hive has varroa mites that are hiding in there, which it probably does, and then you're splitting, that's, you know, you're starting a new colony that already has mites in it. So it's mostly from like bee to bee interaction inside of the hive, just they are in the colony and then they're spreading through a bee going into the other hive via drift and other things like that. Splitting, merging, boosting.
If we plant large-scale pollinator gardens but don't give the honeybee a place to live, is it a successful partnership? So if there's nothing within 3 to 5 miles, say.
So if we plant a large-scale pollinator garden but don't give the honeybees a place to live, is it successful? So honeybees, we put them there. We put them in the hive. So they are not like going to a place to populate it unless it's a swarm that has maybe decided they wanted to live somewhere. My main concern and reason behind planting the pollinator gardens is because the native pollinators need their nutrition. And so they're gonna be there, they don't fly as far. So yes, it's successful, even if it's not directly for honeybees, it's gonna help somebody, it's gonna help some pollinator. Over here.
I heard that the honey, it has antibiotic qualities to it, and that the reason is because the queen never goes out of the hive, and bees are coming in all the time, and could be polluting her with dangerous substances. So the whole thing is made with antibiotic qualities, so to keep her safe.
So this person heard that honey has antibacterial qualities in order to protect the queen from any bad bacteria that the bees are bringing into the hive. I honestly don't really know the answer to that question. I do know that honey never goes bad because it is antibacterial. The moisture content is low enough that it doesn't ferment and it doesn't spoil in there. So I think maybe another factor to the antibacterial qualities may be so that they can keep that honey in there with them all winter and can still eat it as food and not get sick from it. So that may be another factor, but I'm not entirely sure on whether or not it's for the queen.
Keeps the queen from getting done.
Yeah, it's possible, definitely. That makes sense to me.
Grace, we have a couple more questions on Zoom.
Okay.
Do bees really dance to tell their friends where the pollen is, and where does royal jelly come from?
Yes, the bees do really dance to tell each other where the pollen is. It's something called the waggle dance. I promise I'm not making this up. It sounds really ridiculous. I'm sure that's why this person asked that question. That's so silly. Why would the bees dance? But they do. They actually communicate with each other. It's really funny. You'll see on a frame of bees, one bee will kind of run over the top of all the bees and shake them. They'll stand on the top of the bee and shake them and say, hey, I'm about to do something, pay attention. And so you'll see that kind of erratic shaking in the hive. And then basically the bee will waggle for a certain amount of time and then go in a half circle and then waggle again and go in a half circle in the other way. I don't understand it. There is a scientist that has decoded the waggle dance language. I don't speak waggle dance, but there are people who do. And basically, the waggle dance tells the other forager bees where the resource is in relation to the sun, how far away it is, and how good of a quality of resource it is. So they can kind of be like, okay, I know all these things about it. It's a really juicy resource. This is where it is. I'm going to go get some. And then the question about royal jelly, that is a substance that they just secrete with their bodies. So it comes from the bees. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but that is the answer.
Here's another question. Joy says, my bird bath seems to be a place where many bees drink from at the end of the day. Is there anything I can do other than keep the water filled to keep them happy and healthy?
Yeah, so something you can do for those bees, they like to have something to stand on to be able to drink the water without drowning. So if you want to, you can take some rocks and put them in your bird bath for the bees to stand on so they can drink the water better without falling in. It's very cute. That's really kind of you. Yes, changing the water is really nice. And once those bees have kind of found that water source, you can't really convince them not to use it. So I'm glad you're happy that they're there. They won't bother anybody. So yeah, maybe put some rocks out for them to have a perch to stand on.
How much honey do you harvest and when do you harvest?
How much honey do I harvest and when do I harvest it? Every beekeeper is going to do this differently. So there's no kind of like one fits all answer. For my beekeeping practice, we are harvesting starting in next week. So we're starting next week. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be harvesting. And it really, the amount that you harvest really depends on the colony. So my priority is bee health. And if the bees don't have enough honey, I won't harvest anything. If they have so much and they're so strong and beefy and they have so much honey, I will take a lot. So it really does depend. And that's also not a very, very helpful answer. A lot of things about beekeeping are kind of done by feel and by getting a sense of how your bees are.
Have you seen people use those powerful hives and the flow hive knockoffs for supers? And do you have any efficacy?
So have I seen people use flow hives and do I have any opinions on their use and efficacy? If anyone doesn't know, the flow hive is basically, it's a hive that has pre-made plastic honeycomb on it. So basically, like it's already built out. And so basically the idea is that you give it to the bees, they fill it with their honey, and then it's like set on a system basically, and you put a key in, crack it, and then it like cracks the honeycomb open. And then the idea is that the honey just kind of directly flows out. I think they're a really cool, interesting technology. I do think that that would make beekeeping and extraction, it's going to take away the stress of extraction. You know, the flow hive is probably pretty expensive, but it doesn't, you know, you don't have to buy the extraction equipment or like rent a place to extract. So it's kind of a mixed bag. A couple things I will say about it is that the flow hive, if you're harvesting and extracting at the same time out at the hive, it could potentially cause robbing from other bees if you have hives nearby. It might kind of like, depending on the time of the season, if it's starting to get into robbing season, which is into the fall, other bees might smell that honey and that might start their impulse of like, we're gonna go rob other bees. For those of you who don't know, robbing is something where basically a stronger colony will go and like bully a weaker colony and go inside and steal all of their honey and then leave. So we don't like that. Sometimes they kill the hive when they do that. The hive has to be really weak for them to die from robbing, but it is really hard on them to be able to kind of recover from something like that. And then the other thing I would say about that is it is a really cool technology, but it doesn't mean you don't have to inspect your bees. It's very important to still inspect your bees, to still be monitoring for mite presence, treating for mites and things like that. So I think they're cool with the caveat of you gotta be doing more beekeeping than just showing up once a season, cracking the flow hive and taking your honey away.
Grace, when they when they rob the hive like that, how do they transport the honey from that hive to the other? They just drink it?
So how do they transport honey from one hive when they're robbing? They actually have a nectar stomach that is separate from their digestion stomach, and that is the stomach that they use to not only collect nectar from flowers, but also that's where they store the honey when they're swarming or when they are robbing it from another hive. So they put it into their stomach, they bring it back to their hive, and they regurgitate it into their hive. So actually, if everybody has eaten honey in this room, you have eaten bee vomit, just so you know. But it is separate from their digestive system, so it's not really gross like that. It's okay, it's not so bad. It's antibacterial. It's good for you.
So honey tastes different from different places, right?
Yes, that's correct. Honey does taste different from different places. That is because every flower that a bee will visit has its own special nectar that it's going to taste unique and it's going to have its own color. What I will say is that Chicagoland, Illinois honey usually tastes a lot like linden nectar, which has, if you've ever bought farmer's market honey and it's a little bit minty, that minty flavor is from the linden nectar. Linden trees are native to our region and they are all in bloom starting in like June maybe. They're kind of finishing right now. So like if you harvest after the lindens are in bloom, there's probably going to be linden nectar in your hive. So if you ever buy like buckwheat honey, that's bees that have been limited to pollinate buckwheat, or manuka honey or clover honey and things like that.
So there are some places that it's not going to be pure because it can go a long ways, right? Mm-hmm. You may have a field of what you want that honey to be, but it could, for the most part, it would be that.
Yeah, so if you can limit the flowers within a few mile radius that your bees are accessing, then you can kind of, there might be other flavor notes in there, but it is going to predominantly taste like whatever you, yes. But you can't, it is hard to completely guarantee, it's impossible to completely guarantee that they can't access anything else. Unless they were in like a vacuum chamber that only had buckwheat in there and they couldn't access anything else.
So how does goldenrod honey taste? Goldenrod
honey tastes a little bit like marshmallows, like burnt marshmallows.
Oh boy.
It's quite nice. It smells a little weird too, like the nectar got a little bit of the sock smell. And I will say, disclaimer is that this is subjective and like taste and flavor notes are also extremely subjective. To me, I think goldenrod honey tastes a little bit like burnt marshmallows in a nice way. I like it. Yeah. Over here.
So I think I remember seeing some data coming out of the state of Washington or Oregon regarding using fungal or mycelial extracts to help against the colony collapse and mice. Do you happen to know if there's any progress with that or?
So do I know any progress on some kind of mycelium treatment to help with colony collapse? I have not myself heard of it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'm just one beekeeper, so I've not heard of it myself. It sounds really cool. Mycelium are really neat. What I would say, this is an opinion also, colony collapse can be prevented if you are on top of treating for mites, and like one thing you can't really control is access to pesticides, but other than that, like if you're being a responsible beekeeper and you are making sure your hive is healthy, you can prevent, to a certain extent, colony collapse. So a treatment would be really cool. I would say that like honeybees are not absolutely always doomed all the time to colony collapse now that we have kind of figured out why those things were happening.
So a product that is a pesticide that has this chemical that I don't remember whatever you said, is it on the package?
So is neonicotinoid on the package of pesticides? No, because neonicotinoid is the class of the pesticide. It's not going to have like the names of the individual pesticide itself, but it's very easy information to find on the internet. I mean, generally speaking, I always encourage people to try and use integrative pest management practices before resorting to any kind of synthetic pesticide. You can plant like plants that other pests don't like. For the example of the tomato hornworm, there is a parasitic wasp that will lay its eggs under the skin of the tomato hornworm. It's very creepy but very cool. And so that is an example. You can do things to try and encourage the presence of that wasp in your garden, and then you don't have to spray any pesticide for the tomato hornworm. So yes, you can still use pesticides. I always encourage other methods first, but I would, if you're wanting to spray pesticides, I would do some research into the ones you are going to buy to make sure that they are not classified as neonicotinoids.
Are herbicides the same as pesticides?
Herbicides are meant to kill weeds, and pesticides are meant to kill like bugs and like rats and things, you know?
Is the chemical involved?
That's a good question. Are neonicotinoids in herbicides? I don't think so. As far as I know, no. And I'm getting head shakes over there that agree with me, so I'm going to say no. Yes, neonicotinoids are insecticides. Thank you. Good question. Yeah?
Do the native bees make honey?
Do the native bees make honey? No. Honeybees are the only bee that makes surplus honey that we can harvest. There are some species of bees that will make something similar, but it's not really a situation where like we could harvest from them. A lot of the solitary bees are going to be consuming pollen butter, which is that like pollen nectar slurry. So sometimes yes, sometimes no, but none of them really make enough that we would be safe to harvest from them.
Is there any concern about prepackaged potting mixes or planting mixes having any insecticides in there that we should be aware of?
Is there any concern about potting mixes like soil having pesticides, insecticides already in there? I would have to defer to do your research on that one. My focus is mostly on bees and less focused on horticulture, so that's not really my area of expertise, so I'm not really sure on that one.
One more thing, you know the tubes that we had for the leaf cutter bee? Are there other kinds of, I mean, there's different diameter tubes. Is there I have one of those, and I don't know if I've ever had anything in there. Is there the small ones are for different bees, or, you know?
So the question is kind of generally about different sizes of those reed tubes that are in the wild bee homes. Yes, there are many different tube nesting pollinators that are different sizes. So in our region, we have a lot of megachilids, which are going to be leaf cutters and mason bees. And so I would recommend maybe looking into what size of reed is the best for those bees particularly, because those are going to be probably the most likely to move into your wild bee hotel, home, or whatever, based on our region.
And then if it's, you can tell when somebody's in there.
Yeah, you can tell when somebody's inside of the tube. In that picture you saw it was covered with leaves at the end. You can also, sometimes the mason bees will use clay, and so it'll look kind of like mud stuff on the end. There are other types of nesting and cappings in those tube nesting homes, but those are the two most common in our region. But you can tell usually that there's something in them. Thank you very much, everybody.